When we talk about issues of justice and pursuing it, there's many moral and social motivations for pursuing. People always go, yeah, go for it, do it. But what does Scripture say? What are biblical motivations for people to pursue justice? There's so many of them, but today we're just going to look at 4. The first reason for pursuing justice is that it reflects the character of God. God self-identifies as being one who's working on behalf of the poor, who's on the side of the downtrodden, who's a God of love, of mercy, and of justice. And people who follow Him should be reflecting those qualities in their lifestyles. Another way of looking at it is to allow injustice to continue is actually working against what God is doing and against His character. We should be moved by the things that move God and inspired and excited about the things that He is doing in the area of social justice. The second point is very closely linked to it, is that if God is a God of justice, the deeper the gospel goes into our hearts, the more we are going to respond to issues of poverty and injustice around us. In other words, the gospel goes deeper, we respond more to those around us. Another way of looking at it is in John 1:3, it says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? In other words, there's some kind of relationship between our love for God and our response to people in need around us. Tim Keller puts it this way, he says, if you don't love the poor, if you don't have concern for them, if you don't move towards them in some kind of response, then you don't have the relationship with God you think you do. In other words, the gospel goes into our lives and flows out into actions, into every sphere of our life. And if we are not moving towards who are vulnerable in our city, perhaps we don't understand the gospel in the way we should. Thirdly, it is a biblical command for us to love our neighbors. Who's your neighbor, you ask? Your neighbor is anybody that bears the image of God. In other words, your neighbor is every single person that you ever come into contact with. Your neighbor is not limited to people who are like you, who like you. It's anybody and everybody, inside your circle, outside your circle. Anybody that God brings across your path is your neighbor. What does this love look like? How do I love my neighbor? Well, when Jesus is referencing, saying you must love your neighbor as yourself in Mark 12, he's actually quoting out of Leviticus 19. And when we go to Leviticus 19, we see how this love for our neighbor is meant to be expressed. I encourage you to go there. You'll see that we love our neighbors with our possessions, our words, our actions, our judgments, and our attitudes. Loving our neighbor is so much more than a warm, fuzzy feeling, but includes action and even at times includes sacrifice. So when we love our neighbor who has less than us, it involves actively seeking ways to restore them, to journey with them, to address issues of injustice that may exist in that person's life. Lastly, we are called to seek the shalom of the city. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, we see God speaking to His people who have been taken into exile in Babylon. And He said, seek the peace of the city, pray for it and work towards it. In other words, don't just pray, but put action together with that to seek the peace of the city. What a beautiful way of demonstrating and using the things that God has given us, our time, our talents, and our treasure to seek the peace of the city that God has placed us in. So where are we? What are the biblical motivations to do justice? When we look at Scripture, there are hundreds of verses referring to the poor and the vulnerable in society. And there's a single inescapable truth, and that is that the life of a believer involves responding to issues of poverty and injustice. We can't escape that. We are called to respond in some way. When we think about the character of God, we think about the gospel going deeper into our hearts. When we think about loving our neighbors and seeking the peace of the city, we are left with a beautiful opportunity to partner with God with what He is doing in this great city of ours.